this was put together very quickly. We're trying to get this discussion started, so we are trying to live stream this event, and at the same time, I hope the technology doesn't get the better of us. But that being said, we'll do our best to keep this moving. We have a panel, as you see on the screen, with a diverse group of Black architects and leaders. And then after a panel discussion, we'll open it up to questions, which you can send through the chat feature. Next slide. So our purpose today, why we're here, is to shine a light on some of the inequities that exist and persist in the field of architecture as it relates to Black lives. The AIA previously identified some of these challenges, but how much has been done to further that effort is kind of the topic today. Next slide. So at the 1968 AIA convention, in the midst of the civil rights movement, the assassination of Martin Luther King, Whitney Young called out our profession for its thunderous silence on the topic of race and rights. And in 50 years, have we really done any better? The Bay Area, of course, is the home of a lot of activism, free speech, Black Panthers movements, and has our profession really been involved? I think we've often stayed out of it in the midst of turmoil and upheaval. Today, as the movement gains new momentum, are we still sitting on the sidelines? We hope not, and hopefully this discussion will start to move it forward. Next slide. These are some facts about Black participation in the field. As you can see, nationally, about 2% of licensed architects are Black. 0.2% are Black women. And in the EastBay, unfortunately, the statistic isn't much better, even though our Black population is greater, as you can see from the slide on the right. Next slide. These are some of the challenges that the diversity committee that they targeted: the cost of education, lack of role models, more financially beneficial careers, and little knowledge of architecture as an option. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We have a really diverse panel today. We have boutique design firms, we have large firm corporate management, we have community activists, we have sole proprietors. I think we'll get a broad view of the topic, and I'll let them introduce themselves. So starting with Prescott. Oh, can't hear you.
Always forget to take myself off mute. Good afternoon. How's everyone doing today? Thankful to be on this panel and be able to discuss this important subject, not only now, but at any time. My name is Prescott Rivas. I'm a licensed architect. I currently have my own practice in design and planning. I'm also one of the directors and founder of Project Pipeline, which is our national program of national organization of minority architects that introduces young people to architecture, community design, and design justice. How I came to architecture was really from a love of science and technology. I was lucky enough in my high school to be able to have a drafting and drawing program as well as robotics. I originally went to college at Howard University, which is historically Black colleges and one of the 7 historically Black colleges that has a school of architecture, and go there originally as a computer science engineering major. After my first semester there, I was bored out of my mind, and I switched over to architecture, which was right across the parking lot from the School of Engineering. And once I graduated, I worked for several different corporate firms, working primarily in healthcare and academic with a focus on research labs. All while the time I've been doing this, I always have been working in the community. I started working with young people my second year at Howard, and since then I've continued working with young people. And I also really, once I started getting outside of graduation, I started working within Black and brown communities, just helping in any way I could, that being helping to provide design ideas, sitting in on community projects, acting as a liaison sometimes between architects and the community. And since the last 2 years, I've opened up my own practice in non-lit design and planning, where I focus primarily working with Black and Brown communities and communities that are underserved by design and planning, as well as also I am a teaching artist working with various different community-based organizations and school districts to teach architecture, design, and planning.
Thank you, Prescott. Leo? Unmute yourself.
Go ahead. I'm Leo Ray, obviously an architect. I've been 17 years with WLC Architects, which is a firm that's a mid-sized firm with about 110 people out of Southern California, and one of the principals in our Northern California office in Berkeley. We do primarily public sector work, primarily schools and public facilities.
We're trying to live stream this event.
I'm also the vice president of the Western region for Nationalization Minority Architects. And I've been involved with that organization for the last 25 years or so. And I have just recently joined the Oakland Planning Commission as the newest commissioner of the Planning Commission as well. In terms of my experience, my Bachelor of Architecture, and I went to UCLA to get my master's in urban design and architecture. I've worked both for public entities, I've worked for school districts, I've had my own practice, and as I said, the last 17 years I've been a principal with WLC Architects. And so I have the experience of knowing what it's like to be an African American practicing architecture. I'm a bit older, also I've experiences in trying to do this work back in the 80s and the 70s when I first got out of school. Time for African American architects to were even fewer then than they are now. Chat about that as we get into the meat of our conversations here today. So, next.
Thank you, Leo.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having this conversation. And thank you for having it via SF NOMA, AIA, EastBay collaboration. I think it's really important that we have these collaborative endeavors so that the public is aware that there are at least two professional organizations discussing idea of my background. I started at graduate school. Before that, I was actually an investment analyst and sculpting at night. And after that, went to grad school for architecture, Yale School of Architecture, where during the program, I was very dissatisfied for many reasons, one of which was the focus of the program seemed to be predominantly, well, let's just say 100% focused on Europe and a European canon, while every now and again mentioning Asia, and seemed to have not identified cultures that existed, very successful empires that existed. So the architecture that was being promoted and discussed was not reflective of the world that
2% of licensed architects.
And it was very startling to me that the conversation around multicultural ideas and stuff from the graduate school. Graduating, or right before I graduated, I realized that my passion was really around technology and the use of contemporary technologies. And so with firms that have really leaned on engineering and emerging technologies. And so I'm most well known for my period at AECOM, focused on sustainable design, but really the front end of sustainable practices. But one of the things I encountered while at AECOM and I tried to broach was I was designing very high performance buildings and environments for wealthy firms, and the communities that should have benefited from sustainable design practices were not benefiting. And I could not convince the principals and leadership that there was value in working directly with communities to solve community problems. And so I left in 2013, 2014, to open my own practice with the full intent of bringing all my years of experience, both in economics and architecture, and the intent, and that is to see myself as an extension of what I've practiced prior, and to make it available. So we are catalysts for communities. We go directly to communities and identify issues that need to be solved, and then we come up with design solutions with communities. Once we've come up with that vision, then we try and get funding for it. So we are not your typical fee-for-service design practice. We take a more proactive role and really try to be ahead of the community by working with the community to identify issues that need to be solved, and then we try and backpedal into what's that program, what's that funding strategy, what's that development strategy.
I was lucky enough in high school to be able to
my other hat is I'm the current president of SFNOMA, and so this conversation is absolutely critical for us to have, not just today, but on a continuing basis.
Colleges and one of the 7 historically
Thank you, June.
Has a school of architecture.
Lauren?
And go there originally as
everyone.
I'm
Lauren Jordan. I am a licensed architect. I am a project architect at HOK, and I am probably the youngest on the panel here. As my mother reminds me, I just got here. I'm not allowed to be hired yet. So that is something I have taken and run my career. I grew up in New York City and was in a predominantly white school and very used to being the only black face in a room. When I decided to go into architecture was actually right around the time Zaha Hadid had won the Pritzker Prize. And I saw her as a woman, successful, intelligent, and actually being promoted in an industry that I really had not heard of very much before. And I took that and ran with it. I went to Cornell University and got my Bachelor of Architecture. And I worked in a series of different firms, all of which practiced different architecture, but ultimately I made my professional decisions based on where I thought I could be most influential in the conversation of being that black face in a room. And being that person that's willing to be uncomfortable and say things that are uncomfortable and be authentically myself. Shockingly, that ended up being HOK in San Francisco, which I think in contrast, you'll hear some other people's experiences in large firms being quite contrary to my experience now. And it's just goes to show where the conversation has gone and how different organizations
I'm Leo
are
Ray,
opening up.
obviously an architect. I've been 17 years with WLC Architects, which is a firm that's a mid-sized firm, about 110 people out of Southern California, and
Thanks, Lauren.
one of the principals in our Northern California.
Jeremiah next.
Hi everyone, Jeremiah Tolbert II, the
primarily public sector work for Architects
Inc.
Schools and
for 11 years. I'm also the vice president of the American
I'm also the vice
EastBay chapter
of the Western region
7 years ago. I was the youngest, and I like to say blackest
naturalization minority architect
president the chapter ever had.
I've been involved with that organization.
I'm a former teacher of the AIAs.
And I just recently joined
also
the Planning Commission
during my presidency. I started an architecture youth camp. We call it architecture youth camp, but New World Architects Camp. So NWA, if you will. I'm a co-founder with my friend Cameron Toller, who's the current director of Impact in New York.
It'll say. So I think I have a little bit.
I was very dissatisfied for many reasons.
Okay.
Technology.
One of which was
Turn one of
No,
the.
no, they're not.
No, they're not.
What?
Shouldn't be.
All right, that's
Yeah.
better.
And I guess my issue started beginning at school. But as I said, I went into school in the 70s, and at that point, at Arizona State, when I graduated from there, and I think I was 1976, I was the third African American to graduate from that college of architecture at the time. And so obviously it was a very different sort of process. I never met an architect until I was in architecture school. I had never been in an architectural firm until after my first year of architecture school. And so the experience of trying to understand what architecture was about was a very different process for me, because I didn't know anything about it, other than I was interested in building and in the built environment. And I transferred that into architecture. Not sure how, quite frankly. It became a topic, a subject that I went for school or looking for architecture programs. I went to high school in Las Vegas, Nevada. My father's in the military, so we were all over the world, literally, up until that time. And the Arizona was just close. It was the closest area that had architecture school. So that's how I ended up at Arizona State. And it was a interesting process because there was definitely racism at the college, and also sexism at the college at the time. And so it was a difficult process of getting through the school and getting out of the school. And then once I was out of school, getting work actually wasn't as bad as it could have been. Went back to Las Vegas and began working there almost immediately with a firm. But again, when I went to apply initially for my licensing, I would have been the second architect
Black architect license in the state of Nevada at the time that I was taking it. And I left and went to California before I finished the exam process, however. So, but it just gives you a sense of, you know, I'm old, but not that old, that I would have been that was 2 architectural licenses, the whole state at the time. It gives you the conditions of how Black architects are. So you see all the numbers, only 2%, and even less than that for Black female architects. And, you know, we're still grappling with that today. So it's an interesting process of trying to deal with that. And those who are doing their own firms can probably have some more pertinent information about the difficulty of doing it now. I did it back in the 80s with my own firm, and there was definitely, I'd have conversation on the telephone, and that would go fairly well. And then when I would meet the actual, the tone and their tunes would change significantly. And I don't know if that kind of thing still goes on today, but it definitely was very prevalent back then.
Do any of the sole proprietors, Jeremiah, or
this is Prescott. You know, I personally don't have those issues because I also don't work in a space that is focused on, you know, a traditional practice of seeking out clients. You know, I work within, much like how June does, I work within community. You know, I sit on a lot of different boards and committees within the city of Oakland. And just being in that space is how I get projects. You know, I'm there talking about general issues that have to go on how to actually make communities that are not necessarily always based on space, but really based on economics, opportunities, and really access. So just sitting in those conversations all the time, and also as Jeremiah was saying, you know, I sit on several different boards for the city of Oakland. You know, I sat on the CAP board, which is the Community Action Planning Board, which actually looks at, you know, dealing with homelessness and economics through the city. For the last 13 years, I've sat on my Community Development Block Grant Board, which is the only CDBG board in the nation that allows its citizens to actually push the funds out that they would like to see, particularly for their own districts in Oakland. So, you know, a lot of my work is based off of what I am doing, actually just being out in the community, having daily conversations, sitting in on issues, and as things start to rise and there comes a need to look at things that have to deal with either planning or spatial analysis, that's how I get my work. So I'm not a traditional, I don't go after RFP. You know, I'm not schmoozing up in clubs or in business things for, you know, looking for jobs. I'm just doing what I think a good citizen does, which is actually be out in the community. And when you have the opportunity to assist somebody, you do it. So, you know, my barriers are not for my sole practitioner practice. My barriers occurred probably not until I probably was about 8 or 9 years in the profession, when I had enough knowledge, enough skill to really be taking on leadership positions. And the firm didn't really necessarily see that because my leadership was not in what they saw as traditional leadership, meaning that I was not the person that was going to be the technical wizard or the person that would, you know, be cracking a whip on people. But my skill set was the ability to actually really deeply listen and understand what people's issues are, also to be able to cultivate talent within a firm and to also find that talent and be able to mentor them. And also to be able to really to create a different vision and voice for the firm as how it's seen in the community. But that was not seen as somebody that had leadership potential and actually to be able to be pushed up to an associate. It took me another 4 years to become an associate, and that really was on the background where various senior leaders were like, we have no idea why Prescott has not been named an associate yet. He's been putting in all the work. He's performed admirably on every single project he has, plus he takes on all these other things that are not his role. So, you know, I think it comes down to really thinking about when corporate is like, how do you see leadership? And leadership is not defined by just being able to technically support a project or bring in a project. Is many different other aspects on helping to improve the project. To me, leadership is about how do you improve the firm? And whatever mechanism, way that you can do that at a high level, you should be elevated as somebody as leadership because you are actually moving the firm forward.
Lauren, you're also at a corporate office right now. What's your view on this?
It's interesting. The shift hasn't been into total acceptance of diversity and understanding that supporting all of these causes like Black Lives Matter, like Project Pipeline and camps that are reaching out to the Black pipeline, that supporting those things is all part of the conversation. Large firms that form diversity councils are doing the steps that they think or that they know is the step they need to take. It's been shaped by the leaders and pioneers that came long before me. That said, this is something we need to represent, and this is something that we need to have a footing. The national president of NOMA, Kimberly Dowdell, actually has returned to HOK, but in her original tenure did start and found some of the diversity.
A little bit disconcerted that your slide had your AIA EastBay slide for African American women architects as a hyphen. We've been here, so please correct that slide. We've been here a long time, before 2016.
You know what it is, June? There's no collected data.
And there you go. So I'll just quote something from the SF NOMA website, because everyone quotes the Whitney Young quote, and that accuses the AIA, but they never go down to the next paragraph where he says, we are going to have people as committed to doing the right thing to inclusiveness as we have in the past. And it's telling that the AIA never goes down to that second paragraph where he gives a clue as to how to go forward, that you actually have to be committed to change. And so because of that lack of commitment, right now, anyone who wants to start a firm is looking around and thinking that there are very few minority firms, and the numbers have declined. And there's a reason why they have declined. The structural systems that used to support minority firms have eroded. And so now the projects that require MBEs, the MBE qualification or the requirement is seen as a checklist, and it's viewed as the ceiling for inclusion rather than the floor for inclusion in public projects. So in public projects, we have to have agencies that are looking to expand beyond the required checklist numbers. Private, also when they're working on private projects, like say the new Google project, which is 800,000 square feet, we have to ask how many minority firms are on the design team? And is Google committed as a goal to have an inclusive design project? Public projects should not be the only avenue where there is a requirement for minority design firms. And lastly, we also have to point a finger at one of the barriers that's happening now. As a result of Prop 13 and our cities don't have that much in their coffers, they're relying on grants. Now, the grant dispersal does not require public review. So you don't have to do the public contracting process. So therefore, there are large projects and many smaller projects that are practically being handed to firms. Small minority firms are unaware of these grants, and they're meaningful grants and meaningful opportunities for small firms to grow their practice. But not just to grow their practice, but also we need spaces to try and fail. And that's what grants were created for. And I'll give an example. In-law units is a relatively new commodity, but a lot of the discussion around in-law unit and in-law unit policies happen behind closed doors, and you're unaware that these grants are being awarded to other small firms. Some of these firms have zero experience in in-law units, and yet they're being provided the opportunity to learn about in-law units, to learn about the people who need in-law units, to learn about the financial structures that need to support in-law units. The grants are opportunities for us to explore and build muscle. And if you're unaware of these opportunities, then you cannot grow. And that's one of the significant barriers to small firms growing, so that they can take on larger projects. They're unaware of the projects that are available. Public projects are seen as a ceiling rather than a floor for MBE participation. And private firms, especially private clients, do not have a mandate for minority inclusion as a value system. It's more of a checklist. And that is a huge barrier to small firm growth and small firm participation. And I'm seeing the same things happen in the housing market, where a lot of minority firms used to be. And as housing production switches to prefab, I am seeing fewer and fewer minority firms participate because they don't have prefab exposure and prefab experience. And so what you're seeing is a smaller group of firms being allowed to do housing design. So the market opportunities are shrinking, and these are places that small firms used to be able to grow their practices.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of a black hole that people don't know about. And say UC Berkeley contracting, city contracting, there's a certain threshold where you don't need to do a public process. But that threshold is quite high for a small firm. You know, $150,000 contract for a small firm is huge. Mm-hmm. And those don't need to get publicly advertised or decided on. So I think that's kind of a space that a lot of firms don't have access to. And they kind of operate the way a private project would.
Yep.
So next, this kind of ties into it, but what are we doing? What can we be doing as a profession to increase Black participation? Some people talked about pipeline issues. Prescott and Jeremiah are both working with youth and getting them interested in architecture. But how do we broaden the appeal? I think maybe there's some misconceptions about what architecture is. Like, as we see on this panel, everybody has come at it from a different direction. So it's broader than how you see it portrayed in the media or in movies and TV. It's kind of presented a certain way, but maybe that's a barrier to engaging more people.
So I'll start. So when we started our camp at the time, partnering with Fam First, and so our president is Josh Johnson, former NFL player, and his cousin, Vice President Marshawn Lynch. We were engaging youth within the hood, and so when they first came to camp, first day of our first year of camp, and we've been doing it for 7 years now, it was like the first question, do you know what architects do? And people were like, I don't know, they're nerds, and blah, blah, blah. Like, anybody want to be an architect? No, no one wants to be an architect. By the end of that week, everybody wanted to be an architect because they just didn't have any exposure. And so that's the main purpose of our camp, is to expose. We reach them at junior high school age, same as Project Pipeline, and we actually partner with Project Pipeline to give scholarships. Project Pipeline has scholarships for a couple of our youth, promising youth, who really take on and really get involved in what we're teaching them during the week. And not everybody in our camp has to become an architect. Like I said, we're about exposure, but I just recently created a class called the Community Design Process. That's ED 131. It's supposed to start this fall, but because of COVID, it's going to start in the spring. So this is at CED at UC Berkeley. And so that class is a community engagement class for the students, for them to get real world experience. But at the same time, they will be mentoring our youth as they get into high school. So our youth they get to be on campus before actually, graduating. They get to develop a portfolio and also like get that college prep experience. And our goal is actually from that class to pipeline our youth into the UC system. At the same time, the students at Berkeley, getting them prepared to really deal within our community. So it's a mixture between architecture students and city planning students. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get them early and see them all the way through. But this is where I would say that the challenge is, because I would imagine most people who are click on this link later, they're interested in how they could help. And like how you could help is to, one, strong capital commitment to Project Pipeline and NWA camp. Look out for that of the AIA EastBay, but also through internships and hiring. So like I don't want to hear any excuses later, especially after this talk, about, oh, well, we wanted to hire Black people, but we couldn't find them. Because like, unless your LinkedIn finger doesn't work anymore, like you can find us. And like, we're creating a whole new generation where we could have maybe a 10x result here. Prescott could speak to it, but Project Pipeline has been going on for 10 years. And like I said, we had our camp for 7 years. So we can't carry this entire burden ourselves. And so internships and hiring and supporting these programs is a way to do that.
I want to kind of add on to what Jeremiah was saying. It's absolutely important that we do reach out to young people at an early age. I've worked with students as far as young as 3rd grade. And so you can start anywhere with them. And it is important to mentor them through. But I think also part of the thing is also talking about the value of an architecture education is very important. And understanding that architecture education is something that is a problem-solving education, which is what we dearly need in this world right now. It's people who understand how to solve problems at various different scales and in various different areas. And that's what architecture does. So through Project Pipeline and everything I work on, it's really about teaching them how to problem solve. And the area that we problem solve is through communities. And we do it by looking at everything through a community lens, meaning that the architect is not the purveyor of actually all information, but is a component of it. And so that's important for us to teach is that architects are people, just normal people that live in your community and do good work. But the other side of this really comes down to is also when we look at the way that architects practice. In the way that we practice, we actually exclude young people from our practice. And what I particularly mean about this is when we look at schools, community centers, and any public buildings, how often do you see architects actually engaging young people in that process? Probably about 5%. And that's because it's probably been maybe mandated, but they never actually do that. I've never understood why when we design schools, we do not go in and talk to students. Are they not the primary client of schools? When we design community centers, especially youth centers, do we bring in students and actually engage them through the entire process. I'm talking about pre-design, schematic design, design development, construction documents, construction administration. That's where we as a profession really go wrong. We exclude young people from this process, and especially around public projects. So we as a profession need to be better about pushing back to the client. All public projects should have an engagement process for young people. I just don't get it. When we talk about that we want to build a society that's just and right, we need to start with our youngest citizens, because they're the ones that, especially when we have these projects that are a 50-year project, they're going to have to deal with the ramifications of when it's finally built. So we as a profession must be more upfront about ensuring we engage young people so they understand the value of architecture, and really more importantly, that no matter where they are, they have the ability to provide expertise to actually how to shape their own communities. We do that, we will probably have so many more people applying to architect planning, community design, and design schools because they see the value. Right now, they do not see architects as a value. And so that's what I would actually say is the big ask of architecture firms and architects is engage young people within their process.
I'd like to piggyback on that, what Prescott said, the engagement of, but mainly from the perspective of engaging everyone. Because I completely agree with what he said about engaging the youth throughout the entire process. But I want to focus on the word engagement, because that has been used as a means to bring white firms to Black communities to help solve Black community problems. And so what was intended with good intention to bring the voice of the community to the design table has morphed into more of a local minority-owned firm that's engaged in community engagement, and really what they are shepherds that lead the way for white firms to come in and provide a design service. And youth are very aware of that cloak and dagger. They're not stupid. And that is a thing that we have to be, the behavior we exhibit is exactly the behavior they see, and they know it. And so the fact that we can bring young people to the table is not enough, but he's right. You have to include them in the entire process, but also the other side of the table has to reflect the ethnic group of the people who are being served. Because this is 2020. We have had 100 years of Black architects involved in the profession. We're not new. We're not something that started in the 70s. We're not something that started in the 60s. We didn't just start last night. We've been here a while. So the fact that we're still having this conversation about it's a pipeline problem, it's not just a pipeline problem. It's a problem that the profession has been treated as if we're artists and we deliver the miracle solution to communities. And what we're talking about is architecture is actually more of an assignment that requires that we work with communities, and that communities are part of the design solution, and that design as being taught needs to also include how do you have conversations? How do you bring up data? How do you unearth data that's not interact differently so that you reflect real world experiences, not just a topographic map? The way that we're teaching our students today, even if you had a minority majority staff, is still predominantly reflective of a European context. And so students are also seeing that you can't even relate to them in a conversation, even if they're sitting at the table. So we have a lot of work to do, not just bringing students throughout the process, but we also have to change how we teach, and we have to definitely change who's providing design services in communities.
I would piggyback on that one more time, because everybody just echo what everybody's saying, and a real world experience. So about 3 years ago, the community center, maybe it was 4 years ago, community center at Mosswood Park was burned down. And so our kids during camp took that on as a project, and our client was the councilwoman of District 3, Lynette McElhaney. They interviewed her. They did, site visits, and they designed a project around that. to not only rebuild it, but rebuild it for the future, you know, because they are the future. That was 3 years ago. It was last year an RFP came out for that project, and it came across my desk. I was too busy to do anything with it, but a mid-sized firm wanted to partner with me on the project, and I knew exactly what it was, that I was gonna be the black face for this firm, but like, you know, I could have took down the project myself. Let me say it like that, and I chose not to. They came at me very last minute, with like a week before, no less than a week before their RFP was due, and so I decided I would do it with them, but I said that I would not be the blackface for the community, and so we didn't get it because it was last minute. But that sort of situation where we shouldn't. I'm in a unique position where I was given opportunities, and so I don't go the traditional route the same way that Prescott was sharing. But at the same time, we shouldn't have to partner with a bigger white firm to do projects within our own community.
Especially a recreation center. If we look at the history of architecture and we look at the history of cities, these type of smaller projects are what allowed firms to grow. A recreation center is a simple structure. And so these types of projects used to be the way that local firms were able to grow. And Oakland decided to reach across the city to a world-renowned architect to do a recreation center. Really?
Yeah. Well, Lauren, you said something interesting earlier, that the first kind of role model you saw was Zaha Hadid, which is an Iranian architect. So there does seem to be a lack of promotion of these of black faces to younger people that might be interested.
Yeah, similarly to how Leo said, right? You don't really see architects until you're in school. Maybe you have some kind of exposure and said, okay, I'm getting on board this train. But to find black female role models, people to model yourself after, is something that, although it's been years, 100 years in the profession, and there are numerous successful and beyond impressive black female architects out there, it is incredibly difficult within the industry, within AIA, within any organization pretty much outside of NOMA, to get that kind of exposure and meet those mentors. When I went to architecture school, joined NOMA, which is the student organization associated with NOMA, and that was my reckoning of, I'm not alone, and I'm not in this fight by myself. But going into school, I had that, like, gloves on, like, I'm ready to just represent and stand up for myself however I need. But there is a community, and part of NOMA and transitioning into NOMA is something that I think Black students do, a number of minority students do, but it's not an organization. And June, I think I've heard you speak to it, I don't even know how many times. It's not an exclusive organization. Having allies is where I feel the Black Lives Matter movement has finally put us. That if you are silent and on conference calls, I actually, it was almost a joke, but in truth, silence is consensus, right? So if you're silent and you're not joining NOMA and you're not supporting these organizations that are already out there and building bridges and building these networks, then you are silent and you remain part of the problem. So we need to promote those organizations. We need to promote Black people, Black faces, Black women to be in the spotlight, to be highlighted, so that when you're Googling and looking up architecture firms in the Bay Area, it should be that beautiful Black face that you see first. It should be these firms that are getting, all of the recognition that hasn't happened. And I still don't know how we get there, but I know internally I sit on the board as a member with Debbie, and we recently spoke about, well, what is it that you should be seeing on the landing page of the AIA EastBay website? How do we get content from our Black-owned firms so that we can be promoting that? And everyone and every firm and every organization should be asking themselves those questions, because if we can see those faces, we can reach out and bring not just the youth, but we can bring the whole community along to understand that we have been here and we are already here, and we need support and recognition for what we have already achieved and where we're going.
Thank you. Leah, since you're part of the leadership of the NOMA, can you talk a little bit about the organization and what their mission is?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Wait a second.
You're on mute, Neil.
There you go. NOMA has been around since 70, I'm trying to remember exactly the year, but in the early 70s. It started by 12 Black architects who were looking for just the things we're just talking about now. They felt excluded from AIA, although they were all members of the AIA. And they felt there needed to be a community of Black architects that would talk about the issues and concerns that they had during that time and ongoing. NOMA now has evolved over the years.
As you mentioned by Lauren, it's not an exclusive
organization that only addresses the needs of Black architects, but it's a minority-based firm with a focus on Black architects. And I've been involved with the organization, as I said, since the 80s. When I was in Los Angeles, I was president of the local LA chapter. I am now currently the West Region VP for the national chapter, and work as close as I can with June and the crew here at San Francisco NOMA. I was formerly president of the San Francisco NOMA chapter a few years ago as well. And I think what's important about NOMA is it gives, just what Lauren was talking about, it gives you that community of Black architects that you don't get in your normal workday practice. That you find out that you're connected to folks who are like you, and work like you, and do the kind of things you do, and that they also understand the issues you have to grapple with on a day-to-day basis, whether you're working as an employee in a firm or working as an owner of a firm. And that's critical for everybody. I think everyone understands that you need people who are your peers to assist you and work with you on things as you move forward with your work. And NOMA provides that, and given that special touch in terms of, as a minority-owned firm or as a minority employee in a firm, what kind of experiences do you have, and who else has those experiences, and how they grapple with issues that they may have in their firm, how do they move up in their firm, how do they do things that make themselves better architects, and you have to have people who understand the things that you're talking about and can assist you with that. And what's nice about what's happening now is that the AIA and architectural firms, whether they're members of AIA or not, are now in conversations about what they can do to assist Black architects in that upward mobility, both in a firm or as firm owners. And that's an important conversation that needs to continue to occur. And hopefully by the time we finish here today, we can give a few pointers as to some things that can be done. I know Jeremiah's touched on a couple of those things already, but a few things that can be done to help move folks through the system better than they currently have. I'm currently a principal with a firm, but I feel strongly that if, I should have been a principal with firms 25, 30 years ago. And of course I wasn't at that time, which is why I went out on my own, because of the systemic racism that exists. There are issues with people doubting your ability and your capacity to do the same work that they do based on the color of your skin. And that is an unfortunate reality that we all as Black architects have had to deal with for years. You may have the same degree, went to the same school, have the same level of expertise, but you're not viewed the same way. And it's a hurdle that we've had to battle with and continue to battle with today. And the ability to respond to RFPs or to move up in a firm, as I think Prescott was talking earlier about the difficulty of moving up in he was working for very large firms. Difficulty of moving up in those firms based on what their expectations are for who you should be and what you should be is different for us sometimes. And there needs to be an opening of the mind and understanding of what the needs are in firms to have people become a vital cog in the wheel of moving that firm forward in a positive way.
And we know this as practitioners, right? We do our design shreds, we put minds together, and we come up with a better solution. And so, we know this, that inclusivity, we all prosper from it, and then at the same time, we are doing our practice a disservice. We're doing the community a disservice when when systemic racism gets in the way. Let me put it like that.
Yeah, that was kind of my next question, was what can firms be doing better now? Large firms, Lauren mentioned, they have more resources to implement maybe more structural changes. And what are some of those efforts that are actually successful, or is it just lip service? And what about smaller firms, which make up most of the Bay Area, or the East Bay at least? It's mostly small firms. So what can they do?
Well, I think one of the things to start with is there should be kind of maybe a conversation among what is systemic racism,
and what are the ways
that it
manifests itself.
Whether it's with small firms, whether it's with clients, whether it's with large firms, how does systemic racism, what are the ways? I think a lot of people don't really know what it is, and don't know even if they see it, they're not clear on how it addresses itself. So I think I'd like to have some of the other panelists kind of talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on and continue that. I'll give an example of systemic racism. When I reopened the practice 2015, I made an effort to reach out to all of the large firms, introduce myself. We had left AECOM and started my own practice, was looking forward to teaming. And that's one way I expected to, as a small firm, team with large firms that I had either worked for or worked with in the past. And we knew each other, and so I would be able to have support to go after larger projects. And I'll never forget this one meeting with a very senior level. It was a principal of a major large architecture firm. And he basically said that Black firms are looking for a handout. And the next question he said, basically, well, a lot on marketing. And so I wanted to really say to him, the fact that I'm here in your space, I'm actually spending billable hour time trying to market myself to you as a potential partner. And that is racism, is the fact that he them so that because I was looking for a handout, and that was not the case. Teaming is something what we do in architecture. We don't do anything by ourselves. In all the ways to produce a set of drawings is through a team. And that mindset exists at the principal level, it exists at the mid-management level, and that's something that large firms really have to address and is to change within the firm. But I highly recommend that anyone who's a small firm to start talking to larger firms and team, because that was the only way you're going to be able to get projects so that you can grow. If you stick with just yourself and the projects you think you can handle, you will never grow. And there are large firms who are open to having the conversation. What is fascinating is now we're getting the calls. Instead of my reaching out to firms, now large firms are calling me saying, hey, we want to team with you, because what's happening is because of the economic shift, housing and healthcare are now the primary markets. And so firms that were not so strong in community-based projects are now looking to minority firms to partner to pursue these projects because they have to put food on the table. So at the moment, small firms are attractive, especially small minority firms are attractive to larger firms. And so my recommendation for small firms is to be aware of your sudden attractiveness and really get ready and be willing to have that conversation with large firms, but recognize that there are people on the inside who you may have to educate about their own racism.
This is Prescott. I would say, going back to my large firm roots, which I spent, close to 18 years working in large firms. One of my roles in one of the firms is I was in charge of student recruitment. So I hired all our interns for all our 3 offices at that time. And the key I really thought was, one, you have to set aside a budget amount that's geared specifically for recruitment, retention, and training. If you do not have a budget line item that could not be removed, that sits there, you will do nothing. Also, you must put money for a staff member that is part of their role. For me, I had 4 hours a week that was billable towards that role that I could work towards and work on. And then, I can flex it for a different week. Secondly, recruit from schools you're not used to recruiting from, specifically historically Black colleges. So, and there's 7 historically Black colleges that have schools of architecture. So, and they're mostly back on the East Coast, but they are also in the South, in Texas. So, they are across the country. They have students that are willing to travel. Like I said, I'm from Howard University, and I came all the way out to Portland, Oregon after I graduated, and then I moved down to California after 3 years up there. So they will travel. And then finally, that you must make sure that at the leadership level, there is somebody that is constantly checking the rest of your leadership about, are you doing the right thing from just a human perspective? Are you making sure we are bringing on the best people for this office, getting rid of those bad apples who are causing systemic issues within your office that you've known about for years, but have not done anything because supposedly you do really good work? But they are hampering you from being a firm that can truly move forward and actually be really well and actually do things that are meaningful. And then the last one is just make sure that you really refine about what you think is leadership and what leadership skills are. And that leadership skills are not just based on technical ability or marketing ability, but there are many different abilities for people to bring leadership values and expectations and qualities to your firm.
Lauren, I think your firm has participated in large firm discussions about this. Can you tell us a little bit about what's come out of that?
Yeah, I think the different levels of of cultural competency are the main things that are kind of being discussed by firms. The first being consciousness and being aware of your own bias and your own tendency towards recruiting from the same schools, hiring the same people with similar backgrounds. And so benchmarking data and statistics is kind of where I'm seeing my firm as well as other large firms kind of moving towards, and then actively working to have that data align with either regional or national statistics. So if we kind of rewind back to your beginning slide, right, we looked at the diversity in EastBay, and then we looked at the fact that the AIA EastBay is somehow at that national level, but regionally isn't aligned. So for large firms that are national, international, if you take that broad brush and go too wide, you're going to miss the nuances of your local offices and your local studios not being aligned with the communities where they're located and the regions that they're located in. So definitely seeing that. The next step after that, my personal opinion, is transparency of that data. I think you're seeing it in-house, you see it if you work there, but similarly to any publicly traded company, they should be transparent about their data. They should be showing where they are and where they're landing in this benchmarking and setting targets, and that's how firms can actually be held accountable to, here's where we are, here's what we're targeting, and then you can work out those fightable pieces of how do we get there. One of the things that I've spoken to my HR group about, because we've had the discussion of, well, there aren't any HBCUs in the area, so how do we recruit Black people? Well, there are Black alumni associations. There are all kinds of ways to tap into these talented individuals, and it's a cop-out to say HBCUs aren't on the West Coast, so we can't recruit them. So Black alumni associations, and then the other personal mission of mine is to give your minority employees, your Black employees, a platform. Because out of that, you will see incredible ideas and growth and perhaps some demands that need to be responded to. But having Black at HOK, having Black at Gensler, these are the forums where these types of discussions will be had and then will be taken and more discussed.
Thank you, guys. I wanted to, if anyone doesn't have something else to say, I was going to take some questions from the audience if there were any. I know there's been a lively chat going on, but if there's any questions from the audience for the panel, I could do that. We could do that now. If you just type it into the chat, that'd be great. And in the meantime, if anyone else has something to discuss, now is the time.
If anybody gets a chance to, along with this talk, a good friend of mine, James Garrett Jr., award-winning firm Formula, was interviewed by Architect Magazine. Google it. There's also a podcast. He knew George Floyd, so it shouldn't be hard to find. Say James Garrett Jr. It came out earlier this month. He also shares some things that we could be doing to just uplift the profession as a whole.
Yeah, I think something a lot of you touched on is reaching outside of the normal networks. I mean, I think architecture is definitely a profession of who you know, who went to the same school as you. You know, I know this. I mean, I met Jeremiah through the AIA because he had a client that had a certain need. So these connections get made through association. So how do you expand that? Go outside your normal avenues?
Yeah, I can touch on that, but given that I know that Prescott and Jeremiah and myself work heavily in communities, you know, I think a lot of us came to it because we saw a wrong that needed to be addressed, that there were things missing in the community, and I didn't come to it through an association. It was just plain old walking and observing your environment that you're in and recognizing that your skill set can be applied to that problem. And so I really think, and I've been thinking about this question, when we teach at the university level, at the graduate school, undergraduate school, what we teach is that you are being trained or you're being taught, the trajectory is you're going to work for someone. And instead, what we should be teaching is you have agency. And what I really and truly enjoy about the younger set, the set that has graduated after me, is that they have been taught many tools and are now, the computer systems are there that'll give them that agency to take projects, to take ideas and work directly with communities. And that was not encouraged prior. But now I think we need to really empower our students who are graduating to currently have the skill sets and the tools to work closely with communities. And they're going to make errors, but we all do. But the point is, if you start working with communities from day one, you learn how to have a client meeting, how to talk to communities, how communities work, who are advocates for you, that the fact you need to build an advocate on the outside who will champion your project because you may not be the best presenter. These are all parts of developing a project, developing a design. And actually, when you're in school, by the time you graduate, you already have the skill sets needed. And so I truly encourage a graduate to actually start working directly in the community that they're living in. You don't need to work for a firm to go find the neighborhood association who will gladly tell you all the things that are missing in there through visioning, through drawing, through doing maps, from doing diagrams, that these are all tools that communities need, that they do not have the skill sets themselves yet. And myself and Prescott teach communities how to do their own maps, how to do their own drawings, how to assess a building, because we know that the challenge of changing our communities is not going to be just one or two architecture firms, that we actually need to teach the community members some of the skill sets that we have so that we can change the problem at scale, so we can address the problem at scale. And that for me is one of the most amazing experiences, to know that if you teach communities, you can actually spread architectural skills across a wider breadth and actually get the change made. And I really, truly encourage anyone who's thinking of going outside of the fee-for-service and really want to make some impact in their community, that they start working directly with communities right away.
Thank you, June. Anyone else want to add to that? How do we expand what architecture is, what we do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I guess I'll touch on it. Like to June's point, you know, this is in theory, this is proven. So, you know, 7 years ago, we started off with in our architecture camp with designing, you know, youth center, and now FamFirst has a youth center in West Oakland. We have after-school programs there, one of which is you know, after-school architecture class. But that youth center was strategic in its location, as you know, development is happening and coming down the pipeline for West Oakland and for that community that was the only neighborhood that Black people could live, and that whole neighborhood had been decimated. You know, where Black Panthers were there, they threw the freeway. They took out a library. That was our camp last year. We had the youth design a library because the 24, in order for it to be put in, there was a library there. A librarian wrote a letter saying that people don't read in this community, so steamroll this library. So one of my projects in partnership with Ebalti that they're going to do, they didn't have a program for the ground floor, and so we had our youth kind of design a library for that ground floor. Anyways, I say all this to say the West Oakland Youth Center is also a place to educate our community. So this is what I'm saying is proven. We use that as a hub to engineer equity. Like we're designed, obviously reach the youth, but the parents as well, you know, the people who live in that community. And so as the neighborhood starts to develop, they don't necessarily get pushed out. They're aware of what's going on. They know how to show up to community meetings and clearly voice their concerns and make sure they vote, you know. So that's how we are doing it, not in theory, but in practice.
So we just have a couple more minutes. I'm not seeing questions, but I do see a lot of comments. But I just want to maybe give everyone a chance to close. What are some short and long-term goals we can try to implement? Lauren, do you want to start?
Sure. I think we touched on them. It's kind of easy to throw out a long-term goal of having all firms, large, small, sole proprietor, to have a commitment to justice and equity and allow architecture to make that statement in practice and in your firm structure. But I think what I touched on earlier, having firm accountability, having accountability as an industry is what I think everyone should take on as a long-term goal. In the short term, the platform supporting forums and supporting Black groups within your own communities, within your own firms is, I think, a great short-term step to move forward.
Thanks, Lauren. Leo, do you want to go next? I think you're muted. Leo, are you talking? We can't hear you.
Oh.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Twice. I can hear you. Too much.